Hey, y'all. And I want to say, without an echo, if I can help it, I want to say welcome to the 20th century, belatedly perhaps. So, my goal here is to do a couple of things that have to do with introducing, sort of accustoming, introducing you to the terrain um, that this that this course will operate on. And central to it, central to the whole structure of this, is an argument that began in the early 20th century, around World War I, about what the 20th century, and by extension, what the 20th century's literature ought to be. And you might have found it strange, I kind of hope you found it strange, that a course that features readings in fiction and nonfiction begins with the pair of poems. And at that, I would expect, I hope, again, right, fairly strange poems. And so you might wonder why that's the case. And the first thing I will do is try to answer that. This argument about what the 20th century and the 20th century's literature ought to be really is most meaningfully, if not most clearly, expressed by the two poets that I've forced you to read, Eliot and Williams. And why these two, you might ask? Well, they're rough contemporaries. Williams, I think, was 3 years older than Eliot. And but more important, and they were both Americans, and they both had training in fields other than literature. Eliot's field was philosophy, and William Carlos Williams was a medical doctor. But most importantly, they had a lifelong rivalry, and maybe rivalry is an understatement. They despised each other. They despised each other personally, and they despised everything the other stood for. And of course, most of all, they despised each other's poetry on the grounds that it didn't conform to each's own idea of what the 20th century and the 20th century's literature ought to do, right? Ought to be, I don't want to say about, that's a complicated thing. And we are not, categorically not interested in meaning, right? We're not doing the sort of high school thing in which we are treating works of literature as encoded meanings that need to be decoded. Rather, we're thinking about how things are constructed and why they're constructed in the way that they are. And to that end, to sort of both to elaborate upon the disagreement between Eliot and Williams, and also to sort of model a little bit how we will go about the business of reading these works, I want to talk about these two poems. And before I do, I will take this moment to remind you that this video is useful only in the case that you've read them already and done the work of try to describe them. And I will elaborate a little bit on what I mean by try to describe them for future endeavors that will require the same skills. Again, if we're not interested in meaning and we're interested in composition, then we're interested really to some very large degree in surfaces. So what I'm asking you to describe is the surface, or the encounter with the surface of these poems. Right? They are vastly different, obviously, and so you will describe them as probably as opposites in a set of contrasts. But here's my work on the subject. My guess is that if you're watching this video, having read and struggled through and tried to describe these poems, that the first thing that you'd notice is, in the case of Eliot's poem, we'll talk about that first, is that it requires an awful lot of looking up, right? If you are a mischievous sort and ever have the opportunity to teach 20th century literature to undergraduates, this is a really fun poem to assign, because the first word, polyphyloprogenitive, doesn't, I'll qualify this, when I was able to assign it to undergraduates, when undergraduates carried with them physical dictionaries, this word didn't exist in any of those carryable dictionaries. You can find it online now, but so enormous difficulty, and the difficulty, so the poem presents enormous difficulty, and part of the difficulty, not all of it, but part of it is in the knowledge that one must have to make really any sense of it. on a line-by-line basis. And among the things one would have to know, one would have to have a good English language dictionary, unless you're traffic in language like sapient settlers. One would also have to have a Greek theological dictionary to understand this word tohen in the second line of the second stanza. The reproductive life of bees, right? One ought to know about to make sense of the metaphoric operations later in the poem. And one would have to know probably a lot about Christian theology sort of generally. And one question one might ask is why all of this difficulty? It's a question that will have more meaning sort of later in this episode when we talk about Williams, who doesn't traffic in this difficulty. So to put us in the mood, I'm going to read part of this poem, right? Part of it for you. And then I will talk about who Eliot was as a poet and how he comes to this set of compositions and the implications of that for the 20th century and the 20th century literature that he envisions. So polyphyloprogenitive, the sapient settlers of the Lord drift across the window panes. In the beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Word, superfetation of Toen, and in the mensual turn of time produced enervet origin. A painter of the Umbrian school designed upon a gessoed ground the nimbus of the baptized God. The wilderness is cracked and browned, but through the water pale and thin still shine the unoffending feet, and there above the painter set the Father and the Paraclete. The sable presbyters approach the avenue of penitence. The young are red and pustular, clutching peaculative pence. Under the penitential gates, sustained by staring seraphim, where the souls of the devout burn invisible and dim. Along the garden wall, the bees with hairy bellies pass between the staminate and the pistolate, blessed office of the epicene. Sweeney shifts from ham to ham, stirring the waters in his bath. The masters of the subtle school are controversial. Polymath, surely they are. So who is Eliot as a poet, and how did he come to write poems like this? The key thing, and all that I'm going to offer you by way of summary, is available in the respective writings of Eliot and Williams. That, as Eliot puts it in a later poem, Ash Wednesday, the way forward is the way back. The way forward is the way back. And that is true of nearly every aspect of his intellectual and artistic life, both of which are prominent in this conversation. The way forward is the way back. That Eliot's idea of what a poem is, and maybe I should say this first because this is interesting and gossipy and therefore interesting. In this antagonism between Eliot and Williams, Williams said, and this is in his writings, and this is a quote, in fact, direct quotation, "Consider the concepts that go around dressed as T.S. Eliot. They are completely worthless." I think it's the line is, we know they are completely worthless, but the completely worthless is the important point, right? So to Williams, Eliot is not a person, but a set of concepts that are sort of disguised as a person. And I'm not sure Eliot would disagree. Eliot says in his critique of Williams, says Dr. Williams does a lot of things, but he does not write poems, right? So there's a disagreement about what a poem is, which of course this video is designed to elaborate upon a little bit, but start here. Eliot's idea of a poem requires looking backward, right? So in an essay of Eliot's called Tradition and Individual Talent, he says a couple of provocative things, one of which is that if one aspires to be a poet, one must have under one's belt the entirety of literature by the age of 27. And in that sort of history, that body of literature that precedes him, the paramount figure is Aristotle, right? So the idea of a poem comes from Aristotle. When Eliot uses the word poem, he's referring to particular tenets of Aristotle, which I will summarize. We'll return to them often over the course of the term, but I will summarize for brevity's sake here that there are these various components, which include plot and character and attitudes toward language, conspire to produce by the end of the poem, at the end of the poem, through the end of the poem, a feeling. And I want to be clear, as Eliot is clear, about what feeling means. It does not mean emotion, right? Or as Eliot puts it, mere emotion. That there are lots of feelings that one can have that preclude or are different from the feelings of emotion. The chill in the wind outside, for example, the feeling of being rushed, the feeling of ease and comfort, right? That these things are feelings. In one way, if you're familiar with Eliot's great poem, The Wasteland, which I imagine most of you had to suffer through in high school, if you're familiar with that poem, the struggle of that poem, and even some sort of atmospheric bits of it, then the feeling that that poem leaves you with is awe and terror, right? Awe and terror at something coming, right? Something enormous, of mythic scope, of mythic quality that hasn't yet arrived. And by the end of the poem, we wait for it in terror. So that feeling of terror would be the feeling that is produced by the conspiracy of Aristotelian elements in the production of the poem. And one might ask, right, what the feeling produced in Mr. Eliot's Sunday morning, by Mr. Eliot's Sunday morning service is. And I will suggest to you that without making you suffer through my rereading of the poem, that precisely the difficulty, the struggle through the difficulty is is required to produce the feeling at the end of the poem. What I mean by that is this. The poem, the experience of reading the poem, and I trust you agree, because it requires us to know so many things, to look up so many things, to come to understandings of words, most of which are English, but not all of them, and their function within the poem, the difficulty of that is relieved in the last stanza. Sweeney shifts from ham to ham, from butt cheek to butt cheek, stirring the waters of his bath. Away goes, and we probably, I'm just going to speak for you. We feel that, right? The relief of the burden of difficulty, the arrival at simplicity, as that relief is the feeling that the elements of the poem, that the Aristotelian elements conspire to produce by, at, and through the poem's end. And this is deliberate. The content-wise, and we won't occupy ourselves with meaning, I promise, but this poem's content, its subject matter, is the difficulty produced by Christian theologians who, by producing that difficulty, obscure and make nearly impossible to reach the original oneness of God. Polyphyloprogenitive, productive of many offspring, the sapient settlers of the Lord. These are the theologians, the sort of learned salesmen of Christianity, drift across the window panes in two senses, I think, in reference to stained glass windows, but also in their sort of airiness, right? Their the drift of high, inaccessible theological talk. In the beginning was the word repeated, and two things come from repetition. In all things, I interrupt myself, I trust you'll get used to it. In all things, although the ostensible subject matter is, the works that we're going to read, the writers we're going to read, at the end of the day, its value, the value of all of this is to your own work, whatever that is. And so when I do little things, tangential little things like I'm about to do, talk about repetition, I have not just the work in front of us in mind, but also your own work, the application of this learning. So in the beginning of the word repeated, And what repetition does, one of two things. It either underscores, emphasizes, that's possible, but more likely than not, it deflates, right? In repetition comes a deflation of intensity of meaning, of intensity of atmosphere, and so on. So when we hit for the first time at the end of the first stanza, in the beginning was the word, we recognize it's the origin of that, right? We recognize some relationship to the Bible. The repetition of it, right, makes the first encounter less powerful, less meaningful, right? And that is illustrates, right, in that feeling, and this is the Aristotelian bit that Eliot is always interested in, and which we will return to regularly, in the deflation of meaning, by way of the repetition, we move from the awe and power of the original utterance, biblical utterance, to the repetition of the theologians traffic in. There's a dilution of power that is produced by the theologians, right? We continue, right? More difficulty, more we need to know about Renaissance paintings, and and some small bit of fairly common sort of theological language. But what's interesting is that in the third stanza, right, third and fourth stanza, we have a bath, right, and the bath that represented here is the baptism of Christ, so that when we return to a bath in the last stanza, Sweeney's bath, butt cheek to butt cheek, stirring his waters, we are reminded of and set in relation to the first bath. So that Sweeney, who, if one is not knowledgeable about Eliot's history or the lore about him, Sweeney was a lower class Boston Irishman who taught Eliot how to box when Eliot was at Harvard, right? And Sweeney becomes he makes regular appearances in Eliot's work, in poems and especially in plays, Sweeney Agonistes, for example, as a sort of stand-in, not a classist stand-in, not so that Eliot, who had somebody in all his learning, had somebody to punch down at, but in precisely the way that Sweeney appears here, as Christ-like, in his simplicity. So Sweeney's bath, likened to Christ's baptism, right, the two baths of the poem, allow Sweeney to be a kind of contemporary stand-in, an alternative to the theologians who, in their theories about Christ and about Christianity and about all the things that surround those subjects, make difficult and less powerful that which ought to be simple and immediate, right, immediately present. So we fight through the difficulty that the poem presents, all that it requires us to know, as the theologians require you to know them in order to approach Christianity. And at the end of it, we break through, or permitted a relief from that difficulty, to have the simplicity of Christ, of a Christ-like figure in his bathtub, and that relief transmits to us the poem. So takeaways are these. Eliot, as an Aristotelian, thinks his idea of a poem, right, the tradition in the essay tradition and the individual talent, that poem is a participation in a tradition. It's a tradition that finds its full articulation in Aristotle. And if one is writing a poem, then one is performing an Aristotelian act, right, in which there is present some struggle, right, to arrive at a catharsis, right, the availability of some feeling. We'll return again to these elements sort of over and over again throughout the term. They're central. And in this case, the feeling is the setup is the presentation of difficulty, requiring you to struggle through it, and at the back end, meaning is transmitted through this feeling. Right? If all of that is cogent, then it merits a shift to Williams. And the first thing one would notice when one tries to describe this poem, endeavors to describe this poem, is that it is bereft of all of the things that make Eliot's poem an Eliot poem. Right? Its diction and syntax and tone are as simple and direct as can be imaginable. The poem is, I'll use the word bereft, right, which maybe gives some sense of how I feel about it, which is not material. Bereft of the things of poetics, right? Williams abhorred similes, for example, right? He didn't like metaphors, but he especially abhorred similes. He says that similes throw all things out of key, right? Which is to say that there is some key, there is something that the poem is endeavoring to do or to make available to a reader, and that what the simile does is throw off that work, right? That's an incredible thing to say about such a centuries old, millennia old poetic device. Nor does Eliot's poems, I should say, sort of, if they don't have end rhymes, they have sort of slant end rhymes, so that there's the feeling he's aspiring in an Aristotelian way to a feeling of unity. We don't have any of that business from Williams either. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Here's the boiled down version of how to approach this, if you haven't already. Williams says that a poet has one subject, and that subject is reality. And reality is what reaches us through our senses. Right? It is not a reality that is complicated by learning. It is not a reality that is complicated by feeling. It is not a reality that is complicated by one's subjectivity, which can be affected by whether one is full or hungry, right? Drunk or sober. It is simply that which arrives to us through the senses. So there's a temptation, and let me break the poem into parts, right? The second part, the three latter stanzas, are the object in view. The wheelbarrow, which is red, right, and glazed with rainwater, and the chickens, which are nearby and white, right? Full stop. That's the reality that arrives through the senses. The mystery of the poem, and the reason that, high school students are still required to read it, is the first part. So much depends. And if Williams wanted to be a little kinder to us, he could be clearer about that, right? But he isn't, and that leaves open an opportunity for some readers to try to fill in what's doing the depending, and the readers that I'm familiar with tend to go in the places that most of us would go, right? It's something about a reasonably well-lived life, or the way that a farm operates depends upon a red wheelbarrow. I want to suggest to you an alternative to that, which is more useful to our semester-long endeavor here. What is doing the depending is the future of American poetry, the future of poetry in the West generally, but American poetry specifically. What's doing the depending, right, is the future of Western literature, and the future of Western literature depends upon the red wheelbarrow, by which I think we can say the poem, The Red Wheelbarrow, in its emphasis on the simple and the present, presented to us without adornment, and directly, as though all reality was available through the senses. Right? So whereas Eliot, right, who despised Williams' poems, right? They're not poems. Williams, who despises Eliot's concepts, right, has a couple of different words for the kind of, for what Eliot means by tradition and what Eliot means by Aristotle. His words are European, right? If it's European, it's bad, right? If it's European, it's encumbered by history. And Williams's goal is to smash that history. He's a disciple of Gertrude Stein, and he praises in writing in an essay about Stein, Stein's ability to smash words, and this is a quotation, smash words to get them back clean. Smash words to get them back clean. So precisely the kind of word that I imagine he would hope would be smashed is polyphyloprogenitive, made up of its ancient roots, right? And a neologism, but with a neologism, a word made up by Eliot for the purposes it serves in this poem, but made up of ancient stuff, right? Smash those words to get them back clean. And the clean is not only the sort of simple note American idiom, but also specifically free of their histories. So precisely the thing that Eliot loves about language, which is the way in which history, tradition adhere to words, Williams wants those smashed. He says about stained glass windows found in Paris that they look better smashed on the sidewalk, right, than in situ. So whereas Eliot thinks the way forward is the way back, that the literature of the 20th century is dependent upon our embracing the ancients, in a kind of Nietzschean view, that the 20th century will usher in a return to Greek antiquity. None shall wither our faith in the imminent return of Greek antiquity, was Nietzsche's line about that. In the same way that Eliot adheres to that past, Williams wants to smash it, right? He's advocating for a full-on, full-time Boston Tea Party in which what's thrown overboard is less tea than all European tradition, especially tradition in the arts, and especially tradition in poetry. So when I assert to you that the red wheelbarrow upon which so much is dependent is the 20th century's dependence upon the poem The Red Wheelbarrow. What I mean is all that's missing, right, in one's view, from this, all that would qualify it in Eliot's view as a poem is absent. And Williams say that is precisely the way forward. Right? So as we move on, as we encounter Joyce and Hemingway and Woolf and on down the line in our very rapid survey of a century's worth of towering literature, we're going to think in terms of the argument between Eliot and Williams. I think one of these two figures is more right about where the 20th century ends up going than the other. And I would like, in some small way, I think, for us to be considerate of the possibility that that's true, or considerate of the possibility that that's not true. I've been wrong twice, I think. I'm open to being wrong a third time. But I want to ask you as we're going along, which one of these guys seems to have a better bead on what the 20th century actually becomes. So both of these guys, and this is language that I want to foreground, both of these guys are trying to engineer the 20th century in literature. Aside from their being right or wrong about where things end up going, their two positions are the governing influences of the 20th century. And so as we read subsequent material, subsequent writers, a question that is going to be central to us is to what degree is Eliot an influence? To what degree is Williams an influence? And by which I mean the concepts that go around dressed as these men, and where do we see them in the text? I promise, as we slip into toward Joyce here, that I will elaborate upon in my presentation to you about Dubliners. We'll elaborate upon the Aristotelian, and when we slip out of Joyce and into Hemingway, I will elaborate upon what the anti-Aristotelian, anti-canon, right? But until then, happy reading. I hope this is useful. And one thing I would like you to do is reflect upon this information and try to identify yourself along a trajectory which has the Eliot concepts at one end and the Williams concepts at the other. Where are you along that, and how do you know? What makes you think that you are aesthetically positioned as you think you're aesthetically positioned? All right, over and out, y'all.